Thanks for joining us for another iCan Media podcast. I'm your host, Rob Hislop. You know, when it comes to the environment, industry, environmental non-governmental organizations, or ENGOs, politicians, and even the media want the general public to believe that it's important to them what happens to the environment. Unfortunately, when a disaster like the BP oil spill struck in the Gulf of Mexico, it might surprise you to know that economics often trumps the environmental damage. To discuss this further, we're joined by a professor, Howard Ramos. He is a political sociologist at Dalhousie University in Halifax. He co-wrote a paper looking at the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Howard, perhaps we can just start with a bit of an overview of your article.
Sure. Essentially what we're really interested in looking at is kind of, if you took the environment seriously as the driver of a story, what would it look like? And, we see that there's an increasing awareness of the long-term consequences of environmental harms and climate change. And we were kind of interested in seeing that, what would coverage around this disaster in 2010 look different if we actually look at the story from a perspective of the environment rather than just looking at how political actors or media engage it. So we went in looking at how the crisis in terms of the environmental harms would be covered by news media, ENGOs, and government.
And so when you looked at this, and of course we're talking about the spill in the Gulf of Mexico by BP, when you looked at that, was there anything at all involving the major players that surprised you?
Well, most media studies and studies that look at social movements and ENGOs trying to engage media coverage would expect that more stories that cover things that are visually striking and that have easier messages should get covered at a higher rate than more complicated stories. And so we went into the analysis kind of with that in mind. And to us, actually, what was really surprising is there was some evidence that was true. But what was really surprising to us is that a lot of the coverage tended to be really about people covering each other. So, we were really interested in points of convergence when the ENGOs, the media, and the government, and the oil industry, we also looked at oil industry press releases as well, when they would all act basically in relation to one another, and then the environmental issues were sometimes, many of the times, put to the background. And the story really became a story not about the environment, but really about the economy.
So is there any one particular group that you think is responsible for this?
I don't necessarily place blame on any particular person. We're living in a political and a social environment for the last 40 years where it's become very econocentric. And so I don't necessarily blame anybody for the historical context we live in. But the point of our article is really to just offer evidence to ask people if this is the course where they want to keep going. Especially for media, ENGO, and government who don't have a vested interest in promoting the industry. I would argue that even though the industry also has an interest in promoting development and extraction of oil and natural resources, they should too be very mindful of this as well, because they can also do it in a more efficient way, and it's not just about money. There is a corporate responsibility and things that they can also do better too.
Well, that takes me to a point that I found very interesting in your paper, and that is initially it was the government, the environmental NGOs, and the media that were getting the attention, and you say the oil industry actually stayed quiet.
Very much so. We divided 2010, the year where the BP oil spin occurred, into 4 segments. Before the explosion in the Deepwater Horizon, then a period right after the explosion, a period of capping the well, and then a period after the well had been capped. And, initially local media and government were the first really to respond to the issue. And, it was really a lot of convergence happening amongst ENGO and local media and later national media and international media. But the oil industry was pretty quiet. It was really after there was a solution and the well had been capped that the oil industry began to become far more vocal. And we looked at a bunch of different actors, BP, of course, but also other companies that are supporting BP in the Gulf, and they clearly weren't very interested in engaging the issue as it wasn't looking good for them.
Well, I guess I can understand something like that, because it does appear that there are times when it might be more prudent to remain quiet. But for the environmental groups, media, and politicians to steer away from the long-term impacts of such a severe spill, who do you think is to blame for that?
It becomes a very interesting thing. I wouldn't want to put blame on any one particular actor. I would blame everybody equally. What we're finding is that there's this kind of reinforcing convergence. And so it becomes a prisoner dilemma that if any one of these four actors acted differently, it would have an impact on how the others acted. And when you look at, we looked at Greenpeace and Sierra Club, and as big organizations who are trying to enter a crowded media field, you can't blame them for playing the game or trying to act strategically in getting media coverage. Likewise, with mainstream media, basically competing with other stories and other issues, getting the story out is also a matter of, and mainstream media also being dependent on making profit, you also end up having some of this come into play. And, so everybody has a reason for why they act the way they act.
Well, what about politicians? What do you think their motivation is?
Well, certainly politicians are going to have to respond to broader publics. And to industry, as well as to lobby groups and environmentalists. So, essentially, if just one of these actors would begin to focus on the environment rather than on each other, and rather than focusing in on the broader, historical context that's an econocentric context, things could begin to change. And I actually I'm very optimistic that I don't think people sit around, and perhaps I'm naive this way, I don't think that people sit around saying, we don't believe in climate change, we'd like to make only profit. I think that most people would like to leave a healthy environment for their children and grandchildren. I just don't think that people are aware of what they're doing.
Howard, how I found out about your study was I was looking on the internet and I found an article that you wrote with your research partner, Andreas Hofbauer. It's titled, How to Ignore an Environmental Catastrophe. Now, if you look at the four groups involved, we've named them already, while the media seems to follow the story all the time, politicians, environmental groups, and industry, for the most part, always seem to want us to believe that the environment is a main concern of theirs. But according to your research, it appears as though economics trumps that.
Unfortunately, that's true. That is exactly what we found, that, ultimately, the environment plays a back burner to the bigger story of making money. And concern of profits and economy and jobs and sustainability in terms of the economy. And this was also happening in the midst of the Great Recession, so this could be part of the context. But it's certainly, if we're serious about climate change and we're serious about the environment, this can't be what we do much longer.
In your research, you mentioned that the media and other groups often seem to gravitate towards we'll call them easier, more sensational stories, rather than dealing with the complex issues such as what chemical dispersants, what the effects they may have had on the oil spill as well. What would you prefer see happen under these circumstances?
Well, in an ideal world, what I'd like to see happen is that people actually spend more attention talking about the actual environmental impacts of what's being done, and have a much more informed discussion. So rather than having the flash and the visually striking and the simple story, really beginning to think about the more complex things of what it means when, the balance of algae in oceans starts to get unbalanced, and the long-term effects of, what it means down the road. In some sense, the BP oil spill largely, looked very much solved, and it looked very controlled because Corexit, and the way that the oil and tar balls kind of sunk to the bottom of the ocean rather than having a big slick that you could see, I think contributed to how people have largely moved on from it. what we found in the paper too was, within a year of, the world's largest human-made oil disaster, the company that was largely responsible for overseeing production made record profits. And you see, American and Canadians, basically making advocacy for greater expansion of oil drilling in places like, the Arctic, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, et cetera. So there certainly is a dissonance there.
I was actually in New Orleans not that long ago, and I had a chance to talk to some of the people there about the BP oil spill, its ongoing impact as well. They are not at all impressed with how things were handled originally or how things are being handled now.
Well, certainly, if you're somebody who's living in a rural area or living in an area that depends on fishing or agriculture in that Gulf region, or you've had damage to your business, that hasn't necessarily been repaired just yet. It's not an overnight fix. And I think that's kind of, what our paper shows is that, almost everybody that we looked at, the government, the oil industry, the NGOs, and the media wanted that simple story. And when the more complex story, when the simple story went away and we're left with a complex story that lingers and is chronic, that's where it's remained hidden. And so certainly it must be very frustrating for the people who, will have a generation, if not longer, of disruption. And that, nobody seems to pick up their concerns.
So when it comes to these sorts of disasters, Howard, what do you think can be done, assuming there is actually a desire there to steer the discussion more towards preserving the environment and protecting it?
Well, I would certainly say that for the NGOs, recognizing that they're to be an early riser in the framing of messages or the articulation of messages might actually have greater payoffs than trying to play the game according to what people might expect the media to want to respond to. That there might be a payoff to articulating and framing issues in a way that's more complex, a little bit more informed, more detailed, and doing it for a long-term commitment. But that counters, what's become conventional knowledge in public relations and media, I think. And likewise, I would say the same for media organizations in a crowded media environment. What distinguishes media now is not necessarily to try and appeal to a broad-based market, but rather to specialize on specific issues and specific content. And it's nice to see that, there's a potential for environmental media to cover the issues in a more complex way and over the long period. Likewise for government, sadly, the political process we have in North America is one where people try to get elected for 4 years at a time. And most of these problems are not going to be solved in the mandate of a single election or a single sitting in elected office. And it's time for us to think again that, it's not about just getting elected for the short term. It's about making a contribution for the long term. And for the companies, it's the same thing that, it's not about profit for today only. It's about the long-term survivability of both the companies and the context in which they operate. I mean, you can't drink oil, and you don't eat it either. And eventually, at some point, you need to have a clean environment to keep doing business in.
Howard, thanks so much for your time.
Well, thank you very much.
We have been chatting with Howard Ramos, a professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax. That brings to a close another edition of ICANN Media. I'm your host, Rob Hislop.